I could never have imagined that at my mother's funeral, I would have to face my sister, the very sister who stole my millionaire fiancé 6 years ago, the man I had planned to spend my entire life with. I swore I would never see either of them again, and yet, here I am. What should I do now? Fight or forgive my sister? Before diving into this painful journey, I would love to know where you're watching from. Please leave your location in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. If you've ever felt betrayed by your own family, you'll want to stay and see what happens next. My story may just give you the courage to take one more step on the ladder of life. My name is Luna Johnson, 34 years old, currently living and working in Boston as a marketing manager. The painful chapter of my life began 6 years ago, but the bond with my family, especially with my mother, Savannah, was never severed. Savannah was the soul of our family. She taught me strength, dignity, and how to hold my head high even in the darkest of times. Between mother and daughters, we stayed in touch every single day, through quick phone calls or long emails. Her presence was the greatest source of encouragement in my life. 6 months ago, Savannah was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The day she broke the news, my world tilted on its axis, but my mother only gave a soft smile and said, "We'll get through this, sweetheart." In her final months, Savannah fought pain with serenity. She never worried about her illness, only about how to keep us from falling apart. She passed away in my arms, calm and peaceful. Just before her final breath slipped away, she held my hand tightly and whispered, "Live to find peace. You deserve that." I promised, though even then I knew that to keep that promise, I'd have to go back to a night 6 years ago when I thought I was about to become the bride of a millionaire, only to be betrayed by the very person I believed was family. 6 years ago, I was a 28-year-old woman full of ambition, swept up in Boston's fast-paced rhythm, believing I had everything, except for one thing, something vague, unnamed. It wasn't until that fateful evening at a charity event raising funds for the arts that I finally understood. It was the feeling of being seen. He stood there in the middle of a crowded room, wearing a charcoal gray suit, the light catching on his silver tie clip like a quiet invitation. Waylon Reynolds. His name was later announced by the organizers, lead sponsor, founder of an educational tech platform worth hundreds of millions of dollars. As I began to leave the bar, we accidentally bumped into each other. I spilled half a glass of Pinot Noir down his sleeve. "I swear you just saved me from the dullest conversation," he said, his smile warm, his eyes kind. Not a trace of anger, no flustered reaction, just calm and full attention. We talked for 40 minutes, oblivious to anyone else. We both loved inkwash paintings, shared an affection for the city of Florence, and had once dreamed of opening a book cafe. That night, I couldn't sleep, not because of the wine, but because of the way he looked at me when he said, "I hope this isn't the last time I see you." I hoped so too. We fit together like two melodies blending effortlessly. Every conversation with Waylon was deep, gentle, and never forced. He didn't just listen. He remembered the smallest things, from the type of tea I liked to my once-abandoned dream of returning to ballet. Within just 3 months, I had met his family, an elegant yet warm dinner at a restaurant atop Beacon Hill. Waylon never flaunted his wealth, never pressured me. He simply made me feel like I mattered most. The days that followed played out like scenes from a romantic film: picnics in Boston Common, a quick trip to Florence, and cozy nights watching old movies in his penthouse, wrapped together in a soft wool blanket. My mother, blessed with an uncanny intuition about people, called me after the first time I told her about Waylon. "Listen to me," she said. "There are plenty of men with money, but men who are attentive and kind like that, rare." 18 months after the day we first met, Waylon rented a private yacht in Cape Cod. I thought it was just a relaxing getaway, until dinner ended and he got down on one knee, opening a ring box. A 5-carat diamond engagement ring, sparkling like the entire night sky captured in the palm of his hand. "Luna," he said, "you give everything meaning. Will you marry me?" My eyes glistened with emotion, but I didn't cry. I simply smiled and nodded, as if my heart had known the answer all along. That night, when I called my mother to share the news of my engagement to Waylon, she grabbed my father and danced with him like two kids who had just been handed candy. She made sure to tell Melanie, my younger sister by 4 years, with whom I'd always had a bond that teetered between closeness and rivalry. Melanie had always known how to draw attention. She was beautiful, charming, and had a silver tongue that could make anyone feel special, even when she didn't mean it. When I took a short break from Boston to come home, my mother was the first to embrace me, her eyes brimming with joyful tears. Melanie smiled wide and shouted, "I'm so happy for you." But there was something in her gaze that made me hesitate. It wasn't envy. It was something else. Something controlling. I chose Melanie to be my maid of honor. Despite our past arguments, I believed this wedding could be a chance for us to heal. I had always wanted us to be more than sisters, true friends. At our first family dinner after the engagement, Melanie sat next to Waylon and laughed more than usual. She asked him oddly personal questions about his food preferences, his sleeping habits. I tried not to read into it. Maybe it was just her usual vivacious self. My mother noticed everything. She didn't say a word, just gently steered the conversation elsewhere when Melanie began bragging that Waylon had once invited her to connect on LinkedIn a while ago. I brushed it off with a laugh because I believed. I believed in my sister. I believed in the man I was going to marry. And that was the first mistake that led to all the heartbreak that followed. A month before the wedding, things began to shift, quietly, subtly. Waylon, who used to send me good night texts every night without fail, whether he was stuck in late meetings or away on business, started falling silent. Dinners were canceled, calls went unanswered, and even his gaze, once warm, had grown distant and unfamiliar. When I asked, he just smiled and said, "I'm caught up in some intense funding rounds." But I knew. I could feel the distance. What was even stranger was Melanie. She called me frequently, under the guise of asking about flower colors, seating arrangements, or bridesmaid dress options. Even though our mother was the main wedding planner, Melanie seemed unusually eager. Once, I half-joked that she was getting a little too invested. She laughed it off, saying, "I just want you to have the perfect wedding, that's all." But there was a note of urgency in her voice that I couldn't ignore. One evening, I went to Waylon's apartment to review the wedding invitation designs together. He opened the door looking exhausted, his steps heavy. When he hugged me, I caught the scent of an unfamiliar perfume. Not mine, and not the woody cologne he usually wore. "It's from an investor from San Francisco," he said when I asked, his eyes avoiding mine. I wanted to believe him. I had always wanted to believe the man I loved. But a woman's intuition, especially one that's been hurt before, never lies. And when I confided in my mother, she simply placed her hand over mine, her eyes sorrowful. "Don't pretend you don't see it, Luna, but don't jump to conclusions until you know the whole truth." I kept smiling. I kept telling my friends it was just a stressful time. But inside me, the door to doubt had cracked open, and the first thing that slipped through was a small gold hoop earring lying on the floor of Waylon's car, exactly the kind Melanie always wore. I picked up the earring, my hands slightly trembling. My eyes locked onto it as if it were a piece of evidence, and in truth, it was. It was the first proof of the unease I had tried so hard to bury. When I asked Waylon about it, he blinked for a few seconds before offering a light chuckle. "Must have fallen out of your sister's bag. She hitched a ride with me the other day, remember?" The answer came so quickly it unsettled me, as if he'd already rehearsed it. But I didn't want to start a fight, not with the wedding just around the corner, not when both families had paid deposits and sent out invitations. I told my mother. She was quiet for a long while, then said softly, "If you have doubts, don't brush them aside, but don't rush to judge either. Watch closely, Luna. The truth always reveals itself when people think no one's watching." I followed her advice, but pretending everything was normal while doubt gnawed at me was one of the hardest things I've ever done. The following week, I invited Melanie out for coffee. I showed her the earring and casually asked, "Is this yours?" She glanced at it for less than a second. "Oh yeah, I thought I'd lost it. Must have slipped off when I got a ride with Waylon from the bakery." Her answer matched his, word for word. I nodded, forced a smile. But inside, one thing became clear. They had spoken. They had prepared the story together. Doubt was no longer just a feeling. It had solidified into reality. From that moment on, I no longer looked at Waylon and Melanie the same way. I began quietly gathering pieces. And little by little, the picture of betrayal started to come into focus. In the days that followed, I could no longer sleep. My mind spun with 1,000 unanswered questions. Why my sister? Why the one person I trusted the most? I'd wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart racing from a dream I couldn't even remember. Dark circles grew beneath my eyes. I started losing weight, not from dieting, but from fear. The doubt gnawed at me, little by little. I couldn't tell anyone everything. Telling my mother would break her heart. Telling my best friend Allison might make me sound paranoid. So I chose to seek therapy, quietly. My therapist was Dr. Emily Carter, 42 years old, a woman with prematurely silver hair and deep brown eyes. She didn't speak much, but every question she asked forced me to confront corners of myself I hadn't dared to face. 1 hour each week, I sat in a brown leather chair across from her, in a room faintly scented with lavender. "So, what brings you here today?" she asked during our first session. I looked down at my hands, hesitant. "I'm not sure. I feel like I'm losing control, like everything inside me is falling apart." She said nothing, just nodded gently, as if to say, "Take your time, there's no rush." I took a deep breath and told her everything, in brief but nothing left out. That my fiancé, Waylon, was growing increasingly distant, that my sister, Melanie, kept showing up at wedding planning sessions uninvited, that I'd found her earring in Waylon's car, and that the two of them had given the exact same explanation, word for word. "I know it sounds crazy," I said, my voice hoarse, "but I'm starting to feel like I'm being edged out of my own love story." Dr. Carter tilted her head slightly, her voice calm and slow. "And when did that feeling begin? Was it when Melanie's presence became more constant, or when Waylon's behavior started to shift?" I swallowed. "Maybe both. She's always just there, even when I don't ask, and Waylon seems to want it that way. I'm starting to feel like I'm being replaced, bit by bit." She nodded, her gaze free of judgment. The feeling of being replaced, especially by someone from your own family, can cut deeper than any other wound. But you're doing the right thing. You're facing it, and not everyone has the courage to do that. For the first time, I cried, not over a single act, but over the slow, daily corrosion of betrayal. "I'm afraid I'm about to marry a man who's in love with my sister." I said that during our third session, my voice shaking, barely above a whisper. Dr. Carter stood quietly, retrieved a tissue from the shelf behind her, and handed it to me. "You're safe here. Cry if you need to. These tears aren't weakness. They're proof of your courage to face the truth." I took the tissue and wiped the tears streaming down my cheeks. It felt like a block of ice inside my chest had finally started to melt. For the first time in weeks, I felt just a little lighter, like speaking that secret I'd held inside for so long had finally allowed me to breathe again. A few days before the wedding, Waylon texted asking to meet for coffee on Wednesday morning. He said he'd noticed my recent change in behavior and wanted to hear me out, that we needed a calm conversation to better understand each other. We met at our usual cafe near home, the place we once adored during the early days of our love. But this time, there were no fresh flowers on the table, no smiles to open the conversation, just 2 cups of cappuccino cooling in silence. When Waylon saw how exhausted I looked, he began to speak as if he were the one under pressure. "I think we should postpone the wedding for a bit. You need time to focus on your mental health." His words were gentle, framed as concern, but to me, they landed like a sentence, as if everything was my fault, that I was being too sensitive, too fragile, and ruining the wedding. I looked into his eyes and no longer saw the man who had proposed to me on a yacht. I saw a stranger, cold, distant, and possibly hiding something far worse. And I knew, if I didn't face the truth, I would lose myself. After leaving the cafe, I didn't go straight home. I walked a loop around the lake near our apartment complex. The lake breeze was fresh, the sky quiet and blue, like the surface of the water, but inside, I was in turmoil. Everything felt too still, so much so that I could hear my own heartbeat racing with anxiety. That evening, I stared at my phone screen for a long time. Should I call Waylon? Should I confront him directly with the doubts that had been following me like shadows? But in the end, I set the phone down. I decided to do something I had never done before in our relationship: show up at his office unannounced. That Friday morning, I brought 2 of his favorite salads and the coffee he always ordered, as one last small effort to salvage whatever was left of us. But as I stepped into the lobby of his tech company, his assistant Brianna looked surprised, uncomfortable even. "Mr. Whalen is in a private meeting right now. It might take a while. Would you like to wait?" I tilted my head. "I just brought lunch. I can take it in myself." She opened her mouth as if to say something, then stopped. Without waiting, I headed down the hallway toward his office, a place I'd visited many times before. And then I saw them, through the frosted glass, 2 familiar figures, one male, one female, standing close. My hand trembled as I pushed open the door. My heartbeat thundered, each step on the carpet heavy and thick with dread. I could hear my own breathing, short, sharp, as if something invisible and icy was tightening around my chest. The image I had only dared to suspect had become real. Waylon was kissing Melanie. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't clumsy, it wasn't an accident. It was a kiss, intimate, familiar, full of emotion. Neither of them jumped away, neither of them denied it. They both turned to look at me, and in their eyes, I saw not fear, but readiness. The room fell silent. Only the soft clack of the printer in the corner echoed like the ticking of a countdown clock, cold, staccato, emphasizing the irreversibility of the truth now hanging in the air. I threw the lunch bag at them. The salads I'd so carefully prepared burst open across the floor, greens and dressing scattering like an unspoken accusation. The coffee spilled, staining Waylon's white shirt and the cream-colored dress Melanie was wearing. My voice came out low and hoarse, as if strangled. "So, this is it." Melanie opened her mouth. "Let me explain." I raised a hand. "No need. Everything's already clearer than any explanation." Waylon started to step forward. "I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you." He hadn't finished before I turned and walked out. I didn't want to hear another false word from him. I thought my heart would shatter, but it didn't hurt the way I expected. It was just a hollow coldness and a brutal, cutting clarity. I didn't cry right then, but once I stepped out of the building, the tears came, like the morning rainstorm. I felt sorry for myself, for believing, for hoping, for loving too many people at once. I didn't go home that afternoon. I wandered the city like a ghost, drifting through familiar streets. Only when the amber light of a corner cafe reflected on the rain-wet pavement did I stop and order a cup of herbal tea, something I never drank, just to have an excuse to sit still. My phone buzzed, a message from Waylon. "I'm sorry. Please give me a chance to explain. You deserve to know the truth." I didn't reply. I didn't want to reply. It wasn't that I didn't want to know the truth. I did. Just not today. Not now. I needed time to breathe, to steady myself, to not fall apart right there. A week passed since I had witnessed what I did. The wound hadn't dulled. Every morning was a battle with myself just to keep moving forward. Then one morning, a message came from Melanie. The subject line was cold and brief. "I want to talk." I read it, but didn't respond right away. Instead, I took my dog Titan for a walk down the block. After returning home, I texted her back. "Let's talk at Mom and Dad's." That afternoon, we met at our parents' house in the living room that still held the soft fragrance of our mother's perfume. Melanie sat across from me, her eyes stripped of the usual arrogance. She wore simple clothes, no makeup, no defense. Just a woman who looked tired, who would shed the mask she usually wore. "What happened between me and Waylon didn't just start recently," she said, her voice lower than I'd ever heard. "It started at the engagement party." I said nothing. I just sat there, hands clasped tightly together. I didn't plan it. I didn't think it would go this far. It began with conversations when you were busy. Waylon said he felt lonely, said he wasn't being heard. I was stupid to believe that what we had was real. Melanie cried, but this time I felt no pity, only disgust. I thought if I told you sooner, you'd never forgive me, but staying silent only made me more despicable. I nodded, not in agreement, but because I had finally heard what I needed, the truth. We planned to keep it quiet until after the wedding, she admitted. I let out a dry, hollow laugh. He couldn't keep lying, or couldn't keep tolerating me. Melanie bowed her head. She started to say something, then stopped. Her lips pressed together as if swallowing words that would never be spoken. "Thank you," I said as I stood. "Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because I deserve freedom from the questions that never had answers." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay motionless, staring at the ceiling like I was waiting for an answer from the void. The next morning, I picked up my phone and FaceTimed home. When the call connected, my mother appeared on screen, bathed in the soft light of our familiar kitchen. Her eyes immediately changed when she saw my face, especially the swollen eyes, puffy from crying through the night. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice soft but full of concern. I couldn't hold back the tears anymore. The pain, the shame, the fear, it all came rushing out. I buried my face in my hands, sobs breaking from my chest like they were the only thing I had left. A voice rang out from the living room behind her, my father's, deep and firm. "Stay right there, we're coming." They arrived at my apartment that very afternoon. My father's anger was palpable. He paced the living room, muttering about betrayal, unable to comprehend how Melanie could have done what she did. Meanwhile, my mother sat beside me, her eyes kind but grave. She took my hand and said, "I will speak to Melanie. This can't go on like this." My friends came too, but there were silences between their questions, glances I couldn't unsee. Allison, who once told me wedding stress is normal, now looked at me with guilt in her eyes. I knew she regretted not warning me sooner, but I wasn't angry. I was just tired. Over the next week, my mother became my emotional anchor. She helped me cancel everything: venues, vendors, family notifications. When I broke down, she held me and said, "You will get through this, Luna. You're stronger than you think." But my relationship with Melanie was beyond repair. Family dinners turned tense. I once left midway through a meal, unable to bear how she acted like nothing had happened. My father, usually the family's calm center, began to break under the pressure. He developed insomnia, high blood pressure, and started seeing doctors regularly. I realized I needed change. I requested a 2-month unpaid leave. Then I submitted a transfer application and was offered a marketing director position at the Chicago branch. When I told my mother, she wasn't surprised. She just asked, "Are you ready to forgive Melanie?" I shook my head. "I don't know, but I'll stay in touch." The day I left, both my parents came to see me off at the airport. My mother held me tightly, then stepped back, placed her hand on my cheek, and said, "You don't need to forgive to heal, but you do need to let go of the past to live." I boarded the plane with a suitcase of clothes, a box of memories, and a promise to myself. I would begin again, not to forget, but to discover who I truly was after all that I had lost. Chicago was colder than I expected, not just the weather, but the solitude. I was living alone in a strange city, without the comfort of my parents, without friends, without anyone who knew who I used to be. I rented a small apartment near Lincoln Park, where a wide lake reflected the sky and trees cast long shadows over the walking path. Each morning, I brewed coffee, wrapped myself in a sweater, and stepped out onto the balcony to watch the stream of commuters, each with their own rhythm, as if none of them had ever known heartbreak. Meanwhile, I was still learning how to walk forward without looking back. My new role at the Chicago branch kept me busy. I led a young, enthusiastic team, and none of them knew anything about my past. Nothing about Waylon, about Melanie, about the wedding that almost was. That anonymity brought a strange sense of relief. At least here, no one looked at me with pity. Most evenings, I came home late, ate a simple dinner, then read, or just played soft music and sat alone. But in that silence, I began to hear myself more clearly. No more noise from doubts, excuses, or the haunting weight of betrayal. I started writing again, not a diary, but short pieces, thoughts, fragments of feeling. Writing helped me detach from the past, as if I were scripting a new story, one where I was the main character, a woman learning to live again. 3 months later, I received a message from Allison. She sent me a photo. Waylon and Melanie's wedding. They were standing beneath an arch of flowers, smiling as if no one had ever existed before the two of them. The moment I saw the image, it felt like someone had crushed my chest. A wave of dizziness surged through my head, and I cried, as if an old wound had just been torn wide open again. I placed the phone face down on the table and buried my face in my hands. That whole evening, I couldn't eat a thing. I just lay there, letting the grief swell and recede like a storm tide. But then, near midnight, after the tears had dried and my chest still felt unbearably heavy, I sat up, opened my phone, deleted the photo from my library, and blocked both Waylon and Melanie. I would not let the past control my present happiness one more time. Over the next month, I poured all of myself into work, meetings, strategy decks, and the quiet moments behind a closed office door when I'd cry, then wipe my face dry before stepping back out. I began rebuilding my reputation, quietly but steadily. During that time, I became friends with Violet, a coworker whose warm smile and gentle questions never made me feel pitied. It was Violet who invited me to join a book club, and from there, I slowly built a small circle of new friends. The tech conference in San Francisco was the first time I'd left Chicago since relocating. At first, I planned to decline, but my boss encouraged me to go as a way to network and find new inspiration. I wasn't expecting anything in particular. I thought it would just be a few days of panels and meetings, then back to work. But at the very first networking session, I met Michael Moore. He wasn't the kind of man who typically draws attention. No flash, no overwhelming confidence, just a calm steadiness that caught me off guard. We were introduced through a mutual partner and started talking about AI integration in marketing. But the conversation gradually shifted to favorite topics: books, street photography, and aimless travels. I was surprised at how well he knew the artists I admired. Michael smiled and said, "Feels like we must have missed each other at an exhibit somewhere." After the conference session, Michael asked if I'd like to grab coffee. I hesitated. My heart still didn't fully trust anyone, but I said yes. At a small cafe near Union Square, we sat by the window, sipping cappuccinos and sharing stories about work, weekend hobbies. When the topic of family came up, I briefly mentioned I had been betrayed. Michael didn't pry. He simply nodded, his eyes slow and understanding, like someone who had seen things. He told me he'd divorced 2 years earlier, that he and his wife had realized they didn't understand each other the way they thought. She had blamed him for always being away, for not caring enough. It wasn't easy, he said, but if not for those losses, I don't think I'd have met the people who mattered more. I don't know how far we'll go, but for the first time in a long while, I felt something ease inside me. After our first meeting in San Francisco, Michael and I stayed in touch, at first through thank you emails, then short exchanges about the conference project, and gradually the messages became more personal. He shared film photographs with me, still, layered, the kind I loved. I sent him excerpts from books I was halfway through. No expectations, no rush, just two people learning how to enter each other's world, slowly and carefully. Michael surprised me. He didn't try to save me or prove he was better than anyone else. He simply showed up, in the truest sense. Midnight calls just to ask, "Are you okay today?" Simple suggestions, like, "Have you tried walking by the lakeshore? A change of scenery can shift your mood." With Violet, my new friend, I spoke of Michael with a certain caution. She didn't get overly excited like friends from college might. She didn't label what we had. She simply smiled and said, "As long as you feel like yourself around him, keep going." One Friday evening, Michael flew to Chicago. Without warning, he sent me a message. "I'm standing in front of the bookstore you once told me about. If you don't want to meet, I'll leave right away. But if you come out, I'll be waiting." I went. My heart pounded when I saw him in the crowd holding a vintage novel and a small bundle of dried lavender. We walked beneath the golden canopies of Chicago's autumn trees. For the first time, I shared more. About Waylon, about Melanie, about the long, unraveling months after the betrayal. Michael didn't interrupt. When I paused, choking back emotion, he simply said, "You survived. That alone earns my respect. In that moment, I didn't know if this was love. I only knew that with Michael, I didn't have to hide the parts of me that were still wounded in order to be seen or to be loved. After that meeting, we kept in touch every day. Short messages, sometimes just a photo of the morning sky or an instrumental song shared over Spotify. Michael never pushed, but he never disappeared either. A few weeks later, I received a small package. Inside was a leather-bound notebook with a handwritten note. If one day you feel like writing your story again, let it begin on these pages. I held the notebook, sitting for a long time on the windowsill of my apartment. Winter had arrived and the first snowflakes were gently falling outside, but inside me, it no longer felt as cold as before. I began to write, not to mourn, but to record the small things, like how I laughed genuinely today when Violet told a hilariously awkward date story, or how I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror and didn't flinch with self-loathing. Michael became part of my life, not loudly, not demandingly, just there, like a thick coat on a windy day. It doesn't make you forget it's winter, but it helps you get through it. And then, one night, while rearranging my bookshelf, I found the old engagement ring box from Waylon, still intact. I sat on the floor, staring at it. Part of me wanted to throw it away. Another part wanted to keep it, as a reminder. In the end, I took it outside, placed it on the edge of a bridge, and dropped it into the half-frozen lake below. Not because I hated him, but because I knew it was time to make room in my heart for something new. Time seemed to move faster after I met Michael. Spring came earlier than usual. Patches of melting snow revealed the soft green of new grass along the sidewalks. I was on my way to a client meeting when I received a message from Michael. "Are you free tonight? There's something I'd like to ask you." A gentle breeze lifted my hair, carrying the damp sweetness of earth. I pulled my coat collar tighter and slowed my steps, an unnamed anticipation rising quietly within me. I smiled to myself. Perhaps it was a work-related question or just an ordinary dinner invitation. But that evening, when I stepped into the cozy restaurant we often visited, warm yellow lights, soft jazz humming from the corner, I knew it wasn't a normal evening. Michael wore a white shirt, and in his hand was a small velvet box. He didn't create drama, he didn't kneel. He simply reached across the table, took my hand, and said, "I came in late, but if you'll let me, I want to be the one who stays." I didn't cry, I didn't scream in delight. I just nodded gently and whispered, "I say yes." We planned a small engagement ceremony for 3 weeks later, an intimate gathering with close friends. I told my parents. My mother smiled through the video call. "You deserve this, sweetheart." As for Melanie, I sent her an invitation as a gesture of courtesy. I didn't expect anything. She didn't reply, but for the first time in years, her silence didn't hurt. My parents arrived a day early to help with preparations. My mother checked every bouquet. My father strung lights around the garden like it was a national mission. I was so focused on the wedding that I almost forgot how deep the pain had once been. The wedding was warm and simple, bathed in the soft glow of a spring afternoon. When Michael took my hand in front of our friends and family, he looked into my eyes and said, "Luna, I can't promise life will always be smooth, but I promise that every time you fall, I'll be there. Not to lift you, but to sit beside you until you're ready to stand. I promise to listen, to respect, and to love you not just when you shine, but when you struggle. Because you're the one I choose, not just for today, but for all the days to come." I gripped his hand tightly, a lump rising in my throat. My heart raced, not from nerves, but from the steady belief that these words came from the deepest part of him. Through tears, I smiled and whispered, "I say yes." My mother wept at those words. She knew that I had finally found a man willing to love me without condition. My father clapped and nodded, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. All our friends stood and applauded, their cheers thick with emotion. Violet, who had stood by me through my darkest season, dabbed her eyes, lashes soaked. She was happy with me, and I could feel it without a single word. I stood before him, no longer the woman who had been betrayed, but a woman who had chosen to love again, with a heart that had been healed. We agreed not to take a honeymoon. Michael was deep into a $1.2 billion government partnership project, and I was swamped with a new product marketing launch. But Michael promised to make it up to me with a summer getaway. And I believed him, because now I was no longer surviving, I was living. Summer had arrived. On an evening bathed in moonlight shimmering across the pool's surface, Michael and I were preparing for a long-awaited vacation in Hawaii. We had just finished listing everything we needed to pack, from flowing maxi dresses for beach strolls to sunglasses and wide-brimmed hats for Michael. Together, we picked a seaside hotel with a balcony overlooking the ocean and planned visits to Halakala National Park, Wailea Beach, and an evening of stargazing atop Mauna Kea. I had just confirmed our airport shuttle service when my phone rang. My father's name flashed on the screen. He rarely called this late. I answered, and his voice, shaking, told me that my mother had collapsed and been taken to the hospital 2 hours earlier. She had just been diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer. The phone slipped from my hand. The world around me began to spin. Michael rushed over, his face shifting as he saw the color drain from mine. I choked out the words. Dad said, "Mom has late-stage pancreatic cancer." Without a moment of hesitation, Michael held my shoulders gently and said firmly, "We'll cancel the trip. I'll book us the earliest flight. Tomorrow morning, we're going to Boston." By 10 a.m. the next day, we arrived in Boston. My mother sat in her armchair in the living room, her hair grayer than I remembered, but her eyes still calm, just like always. She took my hand and whispered, "You don't need to worry, sweetheart. I'm okay." I couldn't speak. We hugged for a long time, neither of us wanting to be the first to let go. In the days that followed, I took leave from work in Chicago and stayed at my parents' home to care for her. Michael flew in from Chicago every weekend to support me. He always brought her favorite tea and sometimes even cooked the soup she once taught me to make as a child. At night, I often sat by her bedside reading, while she occasionally shared old stories, as if quietly stitching memories together before her departure. One evening, she held my hand and said, "Luna, forgive what needs to be forgiven. Don't let bitterness pass down to the next generation." I knew she was speaking about Melanie. I nodded, not because I had forgiven, but because I wanted her heart to rest easy. And in that moment, deep inside, a silent promise was planted. In the weeks that followed, I lived almost entirely within the walls of my childhood home. Each morning, my father and I prepared a light breakfast for my mother, ginger tea and soft toast. On some days, she was too tired to speak, but she would gently squeeze my hand, as if to say, "I'm still here." Melanie appeared for the first time since I had moved to Chicago. She came one Friday afternoon, quietly knocking on the door with a bouquet of white lilies in hand. I opened it to find my sister standing there, thinner, her eyes uncertain and restless. We didn't speak for several minutes, but from inside the room, our mother called out, "Luna, who's at the door?" "It's Melanie," I replied. There was a pause. Then, "Tell her to come in." Melanie stepped inside, and we both sat at the edge of the bed. The air was thick with all that had gone unsaid. Mother reached out, took both our hands, and smiled, weakly but peacefully. "Whatever has happened, you two are still sisters." It was the first time I saw Melanie cry. She whispered an apology, and I gave a small nod. Forgiveness couldn't come instantly, but her presence in that moment was enough to bring our mother peace. A week later, on a soft, rainy morning, she passed. She lay curled on her side, holding my hand until her final breath. Michael sat beside me, his hand resting on my shoulder, whispering, "You did everything you could." I looked at her one last time. Her hand had gone slack, but her face still held a quiet serenity, as if she knew that, in the end, we had learned how to love one another through the pain. The funeral was held 3 days later, on a gray October morning. The sky was heavy, the wind crisp with autumn chill. I wore a simple black dress, my hands never letting go of the bouquet of white chrysanthemums, my mother's favorite. Michael gently squeezed my hand as we entered the church. Family and friends filled the pews, but my eyes were drawn immediately to a familiar corner, where Melanie stood beside Waylon. She wore a black dress, her makeup carefully done, though it couldn't conceal the swelling around her eyes. Waylon, still as polished as ever, looked uneasy when our eyes met, composed but strained. When my father stepped forward to speak, I watched him struggle to keep his voice steady. Savannah was the light of our family, a woman who loved through silence and forgave with an embrace. He said many more things, but I couldn't hear them clearly, not because I wasn't listening, but because my mind was filled only with thoughts of her. After the eulogy, I was invited up to speak. Looking at my mother's portrait, my heart felt unbearably heavy. My mother wasn't just a mother, I began. She was the source of all gentleness in my world. She taught me that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing peace over resentment. When I turned to step down, I caught sight of Melanie, her head bowed. As I left the podium, she stepped toward me for a brief moment. "Luna," she whispered. I looked at her, my gaze tightly held. "This isn't the time," I said. "Let Mom's funeral be whole." She nodded, stepped back, and said no more. But in that moment, I saw something in her eyes. True regret, perhaps, or grief she could no longer hide. Michael came beside me, his hand on my back like an anchor against the swell of emotion. "I'll be with you," he whispered. I offered a small smile, though my heart still ached. The funeral ended with my mother's favorite hymn, Amazing Grace. As the first notes echoed through the sanctuary, the whole church fell silent. A gentle ending for a soul of unwavering strength. After the funeral, I stayed in Boston for a few more days to care for my father. He didn't say much, but his eyes were hollow every time he passed my mother's room. I folded each piece of her clothing still hanging in the closet, smoothing out the bedding that still held traces of her presence. Melanie came by on Tuesday afternoon, carrying a box my mother had left behind for me. She didn't say much, simply set the box down and said, "I think you should be the one to open it." Inside were letters our mother had written but never sent, to me, to Melanie, and one addressed to both of us. Melanie and I sat at the dining table like two little girls who once fought over a silver spoon. In silence, we read each line. Tears fell. "My daughters," she had written, "I failed when I didn't intervene early enough to stop the hurt from growing between you, but I believe loss can be the beginning of something new, if you allow it." For the first time since the betrayal, I hugged Melanie. Not full forgiveness, but the beginning of something softer than anger. After that hug, she sat back down, eyes red-rimmed, and whispered, "You know, marrying Waylon was a mistake." I said nothing. Melanie told me that just a few months after the wedding, she discovered Waylon had been using client meetings as excuses to spend nights with other women. She had tried to believe he was just stressed from work, but eventually the signs were too clear. Texts, hotel receipts, and the growing coldness she could no longer deny. I felt like a substitute. He never loved me. He only loved the feeling of winning, she said, her voice cracking. I didn't know what to say. I just listened. Then she confessed they were going through a divorce. This return home was partly to prepare for that closing chapter. I didn't speak, but I placed my hand over hers, a gesture not of forgiveness, but a signal. I was ready to begin again, in my own way. When I returned to Chicago, Michael was waiting for me at the airport with a bouquet of white tulips, my mother's favorite flower. "Welcome back," he said. I nodded and squeezed his hand. Life didn't return to what it was, but I had changed, stronger, softer, and at peace. The very thing my mother always told me was worth keeping most. So now, what would you do in my situation? Would you choose to forgive or seek revenge? If you chose revenge, how would you carry it out? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. If you resonated with my journey, please like and subscribe for more real-life stories. Your support means everything to this channel. And don't forget to share this with someone who might need it, because sometimes it's not our enemies who hurt us most, it's family. Thank you for watching, and remember, if you can, choose forgiveness.